Crossovers between two franchises are rare. Most crossovers these days are just a company gaining access to another franchise's assets to feature in their own franchise. Crossovers between two separate franchises that aren't owned by the same parent company working together to merge their respective gameplay is almost unheard of, which is why it's surprising that Professor Layton vs Phoenix Wright is still under discussed, being one of the only games that took on this challenge. Yet the game is often dismissed as a missed opportunity, a spin-off, and predominantly a later game with Phoenix Wright merely featuring. In this video I'm going to argue against those criticisms and argue that this crossover actually got the best out of both franchises, as this is the best art and characterization I've seen of Phoenix Wright. Having 4 characters also meant that Phoenix didn't need to narrate everything from the first perspective. Instead, he has greater opportunity to showcase his emotional range and understate character development. For example, he's seething after Maya was thrown into the fire and lashes out at Barham for the hypocrisy of killing someone whose name was just cleared. Yet he can't just move on to the next unrelated case as he usually does. Instead, he's stuck in Labyrinthia and has an obligation to protect the Speller. So he chooses to keep pressing forward and leads a demoralized Luke and a Speller. So I think the crossover enabled us to see a side of Phoenix that we wouldn't have otherwise seen, considering the crossover occurs in one grounded setting. So Phoenix is more invested in the world and has continuous involvement with the same set of characters, instead of the norm of characters disappearing after one case or chapter. You just move on to the next unrelated case. That, in my opinion, makes those cases feel much more unimportant and forgettable. Whereas in Labyrinthia, every case and every detail is important as you work towards a bigger goal of uncovering what Labyrinthia's secret is. The grounded setting also enabled Maya's personality to flourish and stand out more, as she grows very attached to Bella and arguably becomes the most determined to protect her. She also provides comedic relief by being much more chaotic than the gentlemanly Luke and Layton, whose demeanor is virtually the same as their traditional games. But I like how we got to see Luke without the Professor, as the spin-off rotated which characters he would control, as Luke paired up with Phoenix, who is initially very angry at, but later apologizes and realizes that he has to remain calm and act like the Professor's apprentice. But it's no wonder that emotions ran so high, because the stakes within the courtrooms were so great, not only because the guilty are sentenced to death, but also because of the courtroom atmosphere that Ace Attorney creator credits with being more oppressive due to the 3DS. But even without the 3D filter, the environment is very unwelcoming, as the dark medieval courtroom is in stark contrast to the vibrant, cartoony look of the originals. Only a few candles lighten the area while the accused hangs over a bit of fire, banished from speaking or testifying. You're also no longer fighting against just a well-respected prosecutor, but Labyrinthia's head knight who the crowd vehemently supports. And unlike the other games where the crowd is made up of anonymous spectators, and you only deal with people relevant to the case, in Labyrinthia you are closely involved with the townspeople who are distrusting and suspicious of your presence due to your public support of a Speller. Despite this hostile environment, Phoenix is rarely shaken in court, whereas in the originals he's a lot more comical and can easily be thrown off by new evidence. But here he steadily builds confidence and uses Labyrinthia's backwards logic to his advantage, as Labyrinthia rejects indisputable photographs and fingerprints that forces you to make judgments about the reliability of disputable evidence like sketches and footprints. This really challenges you to think ahead and consider how you think the events unfolded. You can also present spells from the Telia Magica that added further depth and complexity to your decision making, But if this ever gets too overwhelming, the crossover introduces hint points in trials that narrows down the amount of evidence. That is a much better solution than autoplay in Great Ace Attorney, that essentially takes the controller out of your hand and answers the question for you, whereas the hint points empower you to still make a decision and use your critical thinking, just with a much less overwhelming amount of choices. Overall, the hint points were the perfect solution to help players with these difficult cases that are reinforced by the imposing atmosphere. I didn't always find that the puzzles matched the cinematic setting that they occurred in though. For example, the Storyteller's Tower is an intimidating castle that holds the answers to the mystery of Labyrinthia, but instead of a series of mind-bending puzzles, there's just consecutive jigsaw puzzle swaps. I can understand if the developers wanted to keep players in a rhythm and not drag out this very long-winded climax any further, but at the same time, these puzzles are one of the final opportunities to leave the player with a strong impression about the puzzle elements, and I was left rather unsatisfied with the lack of challenge. Whereas even somewhere like the Towering Pagoda in Lost or Unrun Future, while not having the most difficult puzzles, each at least provided a unique challenge. Whereas this game had a lot of repetitive puzzle designs that weren't particularly innovative or challenging. That's not to say I didn't struggle at all, and as a new player it was comforting that the puzzles were designed to be very accessible, but I just wish the puzzles were a little bit more difficult in the climax to match the intense setting. Nevertheless, I honestly believe that the puzzles and trials do mesh really well, as the puzzles force you to slow down and provided a much needed breather from the marathon-length trials. The puzzles also give you something engaging and interactive for the otherwise very long and tedious investigation segments of Ace Attorney, where you're just reading through slugs of dialogue, picking up obvious bits of evidence. Great Ace Attorney sought to make these sections slightly more engaging with the Strom's deductions that are more interactive and difficult, but they're still very long-winded and hefty with dialogue. Layton also simplifies Ace Attorney's investigation segments that I find otherwise confusing and convoluted. Like when I was playing the original Ace Attorney games, there were so many occasions where I didn't know how to initiate the next part of the game and progress. And while I can understand if the investigations are designed to be an extension of the trials, where you have to figure out how to progress through the resources and information you have obtained, I also think from an accessibility standpoint, it's very demotivating and frustrating having to run around and figure out how to progress the game. Whereas Professor Layton simplifies progression by giving the player a puzzle. This also gave back some control to the player, as you can decide to what extent you want to investigate through the optional conversations and puzzles that the townspeople offer, instead of Ace Attorney where you have to listen to everything the characters have to say before you can progress. Professor Layton further simplifies Ace Attorney investigations by giving Phoenix a map, so you no longer have to keep a mental map of how areas connect to each other and what would be the next most logical place to go. They did fix this to an extent in Great Ace Attorney, as there is an exclamation marker for where you need to go, but even this originated in the crossover. Overall, I think Ace Attorney benefited from having Professor Layton's mechanics in the investigation segments, as you are much less likely to spam through text and rush to the next court case if the dialogue is broken up through more characters and interactive gameplay like the puzzles and finding the hint coins. Ace Attorney also benefited from the crossover's new courtroom features, as this is the first game you can have multiple witnesses at once, and the question or later pursue feature in Great Ace Attorney. You could also contradict testimonies with previous statements. That also has a similar application in Great Ace Attorney, as you pit the jurors' statements against each other. These additions add a whole nother dimension to the Ace Attorney gameplay that otherwise is a bit restricting and can get quite repetitive. The scenarios of these cases and the whole game in general is also really strong. There's not as much the crossover added from Layton's perspective, though personally I enjoyed having the trials as I became much more motivated to do the puzzles, as there wasn't such an overwhelming amount to complete at a time. It was also easier to track down new puzzles as they would reset following a trial, whereas in other Professor Layton games you have to do a lot of backtracking to discover all of the puzzles available. I also think Layton was veering towards more of an Ace Attorney direction with the release of Last Specter, with how you take down a control freak evil mastermind, much like Ace Attorney, which is in contrast to other Layton endings where there isn't a necessarily good or evil force, there's just one big family misunderstanding, including this crossover to be honest. There were further seemingly Ace Attorney inspirations in the gameplay though, as you seek files from the police and question if authority is actually telling the truth. There's also short dialogue lines when you click on items, and even multiple choice deductions mixed in too, much like the decision making in Ace Attorney. So combining with Ace Attorney just allowed Layton to have these Ace Attorney aspects in full, even giving the opportunity for Layton to expose the truth in court, which is another reason why this collaboration works, as both parties are working towards the same objective of uncovering the truth no matter the cost. Although a lot of people claim that this is not a crossover and is a Layton game with Phoenix Wright merely featuring, and while I agree that the plot structure and ending is very Layton-esque, I actually think that Phoenix Wright and the trial element stand out more, as Phoenix essentially operates as the main character, overcoming so many challenges both in the courtroom and in Labyrinthia, whereas Layton works mostly in the background and doesn't really receive any character development like Phoenix. And as mentioned, I didn't think the puzzles were particularly memorable due to the decreased difficulty, and most of them are optional. But if you were to just do the story relevant puzzles, you will likely spend much more time in trial, which is why I never understood this criticism. And don't take it from me, Ace Attorney creator said in the I Wanna Ask interview that while others contributed to various elements of the crossover story, for example the storyteller, Level 5 asked the Ace Attorney creator to be in charge of the story, with Level 5 director Heino adding that he repeatedly had to remind his staff that we would do things as he wanted, going on to say that his main role as producer was to motivate the Ace Attorney creator and enable him to work at full capacity. Some reviewers also say that this crossover was a missed opportunity, but I never understood that criticism either. I think those reviewers are referring to how there was little interaction to previous characters in both of these franchises' worlds. But in my opinion, placing these characters in an entirely new world not only challenged both of these characters vastly more than a mystery occurring in their own world, but also a mashup of previous characters set in a familiar world wouldn't have been as accessible for new players like me. It would have also probably meant that the development would be much more tedious, with the developers arguing over the roles of these characters and how much attention is given to each world. So I'm glad that they instead gave fans a completely new and original adventure that even new players can enjoy, and I actually think the crossover would have been a missed opportunity if it had taken place in a familiar area with the older characters, and that would have likely been seen as an awkward and ultimately forgettable spin-off. And that's another main criticism I hear of this game, as it's dismissed as a spin-off. but hopefully I've argued that the characters do not act like this is an unrelated spin-off at all, at least not until the extra episodes. And even the director Heino said that this is not a spin-off from either series, and that when we were working on the game we always had the image in mind that it was a fusion of the two. As a result, I think this title outdoes both the original series in terms of volume and quality, which is why I even felt a little bit sad at the beginning of Great Ace Attorney, as it felt like Herlock was filling a role that Layton could have played. The game was even set in England's past. To be clear, Herlock does more than enough to distinguish himself, and does fit Ace Attorney's chaotic and frenetic nature and pace much better than Layton would. But Great Ace Attorney draws a lot of inspiration from that crossover, as there are even characters who look very similar to the crossover, perhaps even relatives, which is another reason I don't consider this crossover as a spin-off. But more importantly, all of the mechanics introduced in the crossover are here, and even some of the music reminds me of Layton. And Great Ace Attorney is my favourite standalone Ace Attorney, due to many of the same reasons that I thought the crossover was successful, like it all occurring in one grounded setting with reoccurring characters, that allows you to immerse yourself in the world further, than just being a mashup of characters and string of cases with no clear continuity. The stories are so much more impactful as the characters aren't pretending to be American. They are unapologetically 18th century Japanese, that emphasizes the difficult and pressing environment that Ryonsuke is under. And much like the crossover, the townspeople dismiss you, mistrust you, and underrate your intelligence. And the setting and atmosphere is my favorite aspect of the crossover, as you and the people of Labyrinthia are not only confined to the walls of this lab, but are also prisoners to the fate of the story. And while there is plenty of silliness that prevents the mood from ever becoming too bleak, there's still a lot of unsettling outbursts and moments of despair following Kyra's execution, or especially when you lose Maya and Layton and are relegated to a quiet corner of Labyrinthia, where the music reinforces this heavy, somber feeling. Yet in these quiet corners of Labyrinthia, whether it's the tavern or the bakery, the characters are always able to find a glimmer of hope and encourage each other, which is why I've grown to love the setting and the game. Initially I was like one of the citizens in Labyrinthia, frightened and petrified at the story's next turn, and I would put away the game vowing not to play it again. Yet within a week or a month, I would be back playing again, and eventually I reached that ending, which I was personally satisfied and content with, as it's revealed that Labyrinthia is an artificial town that was built on lies, guilt, and suppression of the truth. And the ending showcases human nature of lying to someone to comfort them and avoid conflict in the short term, as the storyteller suppresses the speller's trauma and guilt by constructing a fictional world, and the storyteller's friend Bedluke show the effects of this as he becomes eventually sick of this guilt and hiding the truth, while the townspeople reinforce this message about our human nature to suppress the past instead of confronting and reckoning with it, as the people of Labyrinthia were dissatisfied with their lives and wanted to start anew, and the brainwashing allowed them to forget about their mistakes. The game concludes, however, that it is not about your mistakes in the past, but about how you respond to these mistakes and whether you are able to forgive others and be part of writing a new future, as Darklaw and a speller forgive each other, as Darklaw symbolically picks up Eve and chooses life instead of dwelling in guilt unlike her father. The final cutscenes were also quite symbolic, with Darklaw and Barham donning the loose white clothes, symbolized by removing the heavy armor and gauntlets. And although, as I mentioned, while it's a very Layton esque plot and ending, it is still very consistent with Ace Attorney's messaging that lies are destructive and just begets more lies, as showcased by the storyteller who lied to the point of unsustainability and insanity. As the storyteller was nearing the end of his life, he had lost his friend, lost control of his story, and even lost all contact with his daughter Espella. Some would argue that the developers lost control of the story as well, and the ending does bring up way more plot holes and questions than answers. Like, how were the characters sucked into the book at the start? How was Darkler able to perform those spells in London? Can you run into the deep black material? And if so, why didn't anyone run into the bell tower that was covered with it? I can make a whole video trying to answer these plot holes and explain the story, which, by the way, if anyone is interested, I'm more than happy to do. But to go on about these plot holes and ignore the message of the story, I think would be missing the point. I think I've learned that stories don't need to be logical, and if you go on to play the extra episodes, you'll realize that this game is not trying to take itself too seriously. And I honestly think this ending is much more satisfying and believable than suggesting that there was this pocket of London with practicing witches, or that this world is actually just a fairy tale inside a book. In fact, in reflection, magic being an illusion was really the only ending or resolution possible, as magic would have been unexplainable or inexplicable revelation for both of these franchises that try to be based on the real world. Overall, crossovers are tricky, and both Capcom and Level 5 admitted that they often clashed, while Ace Attorney creator admitted that it was very hard to find the right balance. And it is very difficult for two protagonists to share the same spotlight, and some will say that collaborating restricted each one from standing out. But Professor Layton vs Phoenix Wright convinced me that it actually just emphasizes each franchise's strengths and shows up their weaknesses.